You're listening to Malmborg Report, where we discuss the intersection of creativity, work, and the systems in which they are shaped. Welcome, everyone, to Malmborg Report. Today, my guest is an union advocate, an activist, and a musician. He goes by the name of Owen Gilroy. Welcome to the program.
What's up?
Not too much. Just doing some episodes, recording. Very multimedia kind of day.
It's interesting to talk with someone who also has a bit of a background in music. What made you decide to transition from focusing exclusively on music to podcasting in recent days?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, and it ties into the broader media landscape. So I've been making music for nearly 20 years. I have an output of about 100 plus songs on Spotify. I've had my work featured in different places. So I have a robust creative output at this stage of my life. And what I really spent a lot of 2024 doing was finding a way to just focus on community building. Through social media, I've connected with dozens and dozens of really cool musicians, independent musicians who are, exploring different genres and perspectives. And it's occurred to me that a podcast is a natural evolution of my approach to connecting with people. So I'm curious, since you're a musician as well, what is your history in terms of playing out, writing music, playing specific instruments? What do you do? Because I know you well, but I don't really know anything about your musical life.
Musical life's pretty strange, man, let me tell you. I grew up in a relatively privileged and well-funded community in Westchester County, New York. It's kind of infamous at this point as being one of the heartlands of bougie coastal liberals, coastal elites, as they like to call them in certain dark corners of the internet. And for a public school kid, I had a pretty good education, and a lot of that was music. I was classically trained as a singer. I played viola growing up, although never practiced consistently.
I played viola too. No, it's kind of wild. I can assure you I cannot actually play the viola, but like the first lessons I took were in viola. And I wanted to play the cello, but I couldn't bring it on the bus, so I went for viola.
There you go. I'm glad we were both in that same boat, because it was only after I kind of gave up on being a stringed instrumentalist that I realized what a dirty history violists have in the orchestra world. I read somewhere on the internet one time that in Italy and Germany during the classical period, the violist was often the conductor's idiot cousin, or like the brother of his mistress who needed a job.
Right.
And they were, according to stereotype, the less talented musicians in the whole orchestra. Hence the long and rich tradition of nasty ass jokes about violists.
Also, in terms of solo repertoire, a very small amount of it for the violas.
I love the range of a viola, though. And that's one thing that stuck with me. I mean, being a inconstant viola player through childhood, I learned how to read sheet music fairly well. I mean, I was already learning as a singer, but it really reinforced that skill. And being a tenor, playing music on a viola, I was often playing things that were in my vocal range. But I kind of took music and crumpled it up into a paper ball and threw it in the trash for a couple of years in school, because I felt like I had spent a lot of high school being some kind of teacher's pet. I was like the choir kid growing up. Everyone associated me with the music program at high school, and at the expense of building friendships with other kids.
Yeah.
And I was not really a theater kid. I was not, I wasn't about to like join a barbershop quartet or anything. Certainly not on college campus. So I put it away for a while. But after a few years of that music, I started feeling deeply unhappy about that. And had to find a way to get back in touch with it despite my hesitation.
And now you are in a band. And I'm curious, do you play a stringed instrument in this band, or are you doing something else? Are you doing vocals primarily?
Vocals primarily, for sure. I guess I'm still working on being a multi-instrumentalist. my singing abilities have really improved over the years since it's one of the few musical practices that I still do every day. I've started playing the concertina again and picking up the viola a little bit lately because I'm in a traditional Irish group that mostly does covers of already existing folk songs, some of them pretty old. And I'm also the director of a small folk choir that's up and running here in the Mid-Hudson Valley where I live. We've been meeting on a weekly basis for like 6-7 years now.
Wow.
Which is no small thing for me, but I'd really love to keep branching out into more and more genres. I feel like playing the accordion and the concertina is a big plus for me now, because being able to play chords to accompany yourself while doing a vocal solo, or having an instrument like an accordion that is useful in a lot of different folk genres. Like I could use it for Irish music, Balkan music, Mexican music.
Yes, very versatile.
Yeah, I'm finally starting to come to grips with being a multi-instrumentalist again in a way that really feels fulfilling to me as a hobby. So lately I've been really enjoying my musical life.
That's great to hear. And I really appreciate that you sort of had that hero's journey where it's like you're the young person everyone's looking up to, the authority figures, the teachers, they're all pleased with you. And then that becomes a part of your identity that becomes a burden for a little while. But at the end of the day, you love music because it's in you, and it's hard to get it out when it's in you. And you come back to it, you participate on the community level, which I want to sort of tie in one of the weird things about me doing this podcast to begin with, because I have a belief that there is an untapped intersectionality between the broader creative sphere and labor organizing. Because as you probably are aware, a lot of people who work in media, music, visual arts, etc., have precarious work agreements, or often are freelancers and might just be gigging and essentially have no labor rights. Since music is a liberal art, and we live in a time where the liberal arts are perhaps being deprioritized systematically. And we also have this contemporary labor movement trying to unionize places like Starbucks, Amazon, which I don't think we mentioned, but Owen and I are co-workers at the Amazon facility.
Not a very musical place in there. In fact,
noise music.
Yeah. Lots of grinding industrial machinery and digital alarms going off at all times. The rumor floating around the shop floor is that Bezos himself hates music and has never understood why people would want to listen to music while working.
I believe it.
Yeah. I mean, from the way it's run in that sweatshop, not hard to believe.
Yeah, there's not a lot of rhythm to the sounds in there either, right? It's all very disjointed, chaotic. You know, it's crossed my mind once or twice that if I came in there with a field recorder and just try to get some of the random ambience, maybe that would be, you know, some sort of art project or something, but not exactly a place that's conducive to like creativity. We work there because we need a job. We could speak to the unique economic zone, for lack of a better term, that is the Mid-Hudson Valley. It's somehow rural, working class, elite, and in between places that are quite different from each other, namely New York City, Albany. It's pretty expensive to live here at the end of the day. But it doesn't have the robust metropolitan economy where people are easily employed in high-paying fields. Even if you're credentialed, even if you have a background, Amazon might still be the best game in town, depending on where you live.
Man, I mean, this is a subject that has preoccupied my mind for a long time, because I have an educational background in environmental studies. A lot of the folks I went to school with became like urban planners, environmental engineers of one kind or another. And I think Orange County, New York, is emblematic of basically everything that's geographically and economically up about the United States. It's the epicenter of what I would call the ex-urban sprawl leading out from New York City. which I guess is just archetypal of any major metro area in the United States and to a certain extent in the Western world in general. Like, just like you said, it doesn't exactly feel rural or urban or even suburban. It's this sprawling mix of all three, tied together by car infrastructure that is being industrialized with this increasing proliferation of warehouses in
Yes.
this geographic band, like like reaching 50, 60 miles outside of New York City, that just seems to snake like a dragon all the way up the Acela corridor of the Northeast US. And it has all the aspects of urban living where everything's expensive and your taxes are high, despite the fact that you have to drive 50 minutes to get anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Put up with an incredible amount of suburban sprawl, despite the fact that these suburbs are now deteriorating in the same way that the old burnt out middle towns along the Hudson River have been since the 70s. You know, the prevailing narrative about economic decay and the decline of the American working class since the beginning of industrial offshoring in the 70s, when a lot of the factory jobs left in these old brick mill towns along the Hudson, just like the mill towns in New England or in the rural South, or the old mining and timber towns along the West Coast. The jobs really started leaving in the 70s in those places. All of the sprawling infrastructure of these few like denser urban areas that we have, through a mix of public funding and just local real estate prices cratering because of the lack of jobs, they became kind of a haven for rent refugees from New York City, namely people from Black and Latino communities, about which the white flight suburbanites of a place like Orange County like to mythologize, being like full of crime and bad work ethic and all those nasty stereotypes, in order to justify moving out into the suburbs, taking these rural properties like a lot of the farm country out in Orange County and just turning them into these cookie cutter split level ranch suburbs to be developed and speculated on.
Yeah.
But that's the interesting thing, is that the suburban sprawl of the white flight generation in and of itself is, in a place like Orange County, is becoming more diverse as the quality of the public infrastructure of them is beginning to rot. Because the economic engine of this continued sprawling development can't really be sustained by the municipalities. The roads are getting worse. I've read a few articles about the crisis of good drinking water in Orange County due to the dilapidation of these sprawling public water systems. A lot of the initial generation who moved out to these suburban communities, who have since sold out, like boomers who have aged out and moved to places like Florida or other places in the Sun Belt, have sold their split level ranch house in a lot of cases to an extended family network of West Indian or Latino families who have moved up from the city, who are now dealing with the increasing costs of maintaining a suburban house that was kind of built shoddily for a real estate scheme in a community where the road maintenance is extremely expensive because it's suburban sprawl. The school systems aren't necessarily as good as they could have been. And the only way they're able to hold on to the mortgage is by having 3 and 4 generations of their families working in these precarious sweatshop conditions at various warehouses around the county.
That is an excellent overview of the sort of unique precariousness of the local regional economy that we live in, and paints the picture as to why Orange County is becoming this warehouse district, if you will. And we find ourselves making our livings by being a cog in that machine. So that brings me back to our workplace and kind of what we're into and what we're trying to organize. We work at a facility. It's a fulfillment center. We go out on machines called pits, powered industrial trucks. We drive up. Whether you're picking or stowing, it's either a matter of putting inventory away or taking it out, kind of the same job, basically. So we deal with this freight. We drive up into the air. We put boxes into bins that are large shelving structures. and we just drive around the warehouse all day dealing with hundreds of pieces of inventory. The workplace is dangerous. And I don't want to get diverted by the idea that, oh, there are way worse warehouses or there are jobs that are more hazardous. Sure, there's a spectrum for everything. But at the end of the day, objectively speaking, as evidenced by the fact that Amazon's injury rate is like 50% higher than the field of other warehouses throughout the US.
That's what I hear.
Right. It's an inherently dangerous job. And we see it with our own eyes. We have boxes falling from who knows how many feet in the air. I don't know. My depth perception might be a little off at this point from the vertigo of going up and down. You can get slammed in the face with a box. You can cut yourself on the products. Every day we go into work, we're basically walking into like a junkyard of questionably useful consumer goods.
I think about that all the time. The toys and fidget spinners that we pack in and out of that building all day long, specifically for the holidays and for like Amazon Prime Week. How many months of use does all this stuff that we break our backs moving actually get before it just ends up in another landfill?
There's also just the environmental costs of what we do, like the internal, like the inner peace aspect of what we're experiencing, and knowing that the stuff we're putting out is going to end up in a landfill. It doesn't bring joy.
Yeah. We talk about alienation from one's labor. Like I worked as an organic vegetable farmer for 8 years out of school before ending up inside the warehouse, working very long hours in pretty crappy conditions for very low pay.
Yeah.
And while there was something about the lifestyle that was very gratifying to me, like I felt like I was part of the solution to all the many environmental problems we face as a post-industrial consumer society. At the end of that experience, for all the personal gratification it gave me, what I discovered was this sense that trying to wage this individual crusade to change things was not accomplishing squat. And that history was moving past me without my having any great effect on it. And at the end of the day, I was just scratching in the earth to create a luxury consumer item, like creating bougie groceries for customers back in Westchester, where I grew up, and in the other inner suburbs of New York City, that just amounted to a lifestyle choice. It didn't lead to systemic change in any way. And along the way, I discovered deep exploitation of myself and my Latino and West Indian coworkers.
Right. And the scary thing about that is it's done under a banner of progress. And that kind of gives it that sort of plausible deniability, right?
That's how capitalism has to work. It has to create new markets so that consumption and, to a certain extent, production can continue.
Very true. And as we live in this world and we do what we do at Amazon, I think my understanding over time, really, I would say in the past several months post-election, as we've starting to look at the realities of where things are heading, I'm starting to sense that and I'm not the only one, that the labor movement is basically all we got in terms of action, right? It's deeper than just our own material conditions. It also is about like any form of like valid political action. It's not going to be a milquetoast critique of the Trump administration. It's not going to be the January 6th riot leftist edition. At least that's the way I see it. It's going to be through like, what the hell can people who are being exploited by the 1% do to actually improve their material conditions and actually begin to create a semblance of a democratic culture and system? It's going to be using our generally jobs as a tool to build power.
Yeah.
That's all we got.
Couldn't agree more, man. What's going on right now seems to me to be a real crisis in the ideology and principles of liberalism. Mind you, I do not identify myself as being a liberal in any way. It's the background that I come from, like a liberal family with a lot of education. Ever since I became an adult and entered the working world, we have just watched the complete inadequacy of the liberal system politically, culturally, to actually respond to the crises of our time and to just continue ceding ground to an increasingly radicalized and rabid conservatism, or increasing apathy and complete disorganization among working people who have no positive outlet to deal with these mounting crises. I became kind of radicalized during the Bernie years when I was like a farm worker working 60-hour weeks, making $8 an hour, which in and itself was a pretty wild journey from being kind of a privileged college kid from an inner ring suburb. You know, my own life as a downwardly mobile middle class person, and perhaps now as a working class person in an industrial warehouse, it's been accompanied by increasing awareness of the status quo and the political alternatives such as they have been sold to us by MSNBC and the like as being woefully insufficient to the problem. And regular people just don't give a shit anymore. Like it's been hilarious reading the think pieces in the New York Times and listening to people on NPR and PBS just completely fail to come up with an explanation for what's going on right now and why, for example, Kamala Harris's failed electoral bid completely ate shit. Like as per usual, the liberals seem eager to cast blame on anything and everything other than themselves, while working people's lives and conditions continue to suffer.
Yes. I think that's another really important point, is that how can you expect to receive the support of working people when their life experience, the past 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, the general theme is nothing changes for me. And if it does, it's probably not in my favor. It's only getting worse, right? I think the only material improvement for the working class that I can think of in the past 50 years was the very brief labor shortage in the immediate aftermath of COVID. There was like a material increase of wages that spiked in a pretty significant way. And I think it even lasted long enough to the point where people on average had way more savings.
That's right.
And that was like a really interesting moment. And that's not even to go into things like the economic stimulus plans and the unemployment programs. But outside of that very unique situation, there has been no material gain. And any of that gain that was there 4 or 5 years ago has largely eroded, I would say, through inflation and other things.
Yeah, and inflation that occurred with the ascent of the federal government, you know, the Federal Reserve. I don't want to get conspiratorial and like allude to some grand conspiracy here, but between the major companies that set the prices for their products and services and the banking policies of the government ostensibly to steer the economy through time of crisis, like what we saw was a response to workers' bargaining and negotiating power during that crisis period. It seems like an attempt on all fronts to claw that bargaining power away, such that we're in the position we've been in since I started working in the warehouse, where I'm making more on an hourly than I ever have in my working history, and yet I'm more economically precarious than ever. I know it's a perverse thing to look back wistfully on the early years of the pandemic with some sentimentality, but when those stimulus checks were coming in, I was saving more month over month than I was spending, when I wasn't just living hand to mouth. And buying plenty of let me tell you.
Yeah. During that time, I remember I bought... Now, in the past, I was actually an avid bicyclist, but I did purchase a new bicycle at this time with a little stimulus money. And I got a good year of regular use out of it. But by the time I moved out here to the woods where I live now, this is like a road bike. It's not really conducive to like riding up hills and riding around where I live. So it's been just sitting there, and I regret it entirely. Or I don't regret purchasing it. I regret that it's been sitting there. So there's a little small example of like, yeah, I bought something. But at the end of the day, if we were getting something like a UBI, if we were getting a well-negotiated wage through collective bargaining from Amazon, you know, there might be some splurges. People have their impulses, whatever. Maybe some people have debt and they got to pay some off or whatever. But once you have material increases for the working class, the broad trend is saving, wealth building, the ability to afford your own goods, and not rely on high interest credit cards, payday loans. But the problem is that once this happens, what do the 1% have to hold over us? Right? We start like building our own organizations, our own political action groups. We start building community centers. This idea that the only way to build this power amongst the working class is just like, hey, you want to sell Amazon, pay up, or we're walking out. There's no room for begging our wise policy lords up in Washington, D.C. to develop a program for us. No, basically, it's hardball. There's no more room for friendliness. It's basically, if you want us to work for you, pay up. Yeah. Make Amazon pay.
Yeah. Getting people mentally in the position where they see themselves on an individual basis, but also among their neighbors as being a negotiating partner in a deal with the government, with their employer, over the terms of what our society is actually going to be. The closest thing we have in our current culture is the hustler mindset. Like, I'm going to grind my whole life so that I'm one of the chief actors in the economy and I get to exert my will over the community and over others by being a successful capitalist. They never think about collective solutions to that problem of being the object and not the subject of the economy.
I reflected on this earlier when I spoke to Nick and drew a realization that in wearing the many hats that we do, working our day job, fighting back, doing activism, being artists, being creatives, being people who are outreachers, we kind of have, because of our conditions, we have to do that hustler thing to some degree. Maybe we're not focusing on, flipping real estate or selling stuff on eBay, but it's still that kind of like, gotta burn both ends of the candle 24/7. And there's a slightly unfortunate disconnect there where it kind of requires similar means. You gotta like stay up at weird hours and find the energy to do the right things. This is a big job. This isn't for the faint of heart, but everyone can play a role. It's not going to be a top-down thing where 5 people at a workplace say, we're doing this, get in line. It's more like 5 people get together, talk to everyone and be like, hey, you can do this too.
Yeah.
And
that cultural obstacle that we have to deal with, that grind set. I dare say in the world of music, the only way to survive either as a full-time artist or as someone who wants art to be a part of their life is to sell yourself as a brand, to be on Spotify, to be on social media. There's no space left for communal solutions in a world where there's vanishingly little public funding for arts and culture anymore. There's no communal space where education or output of music that isn't built around building yourself as a brand or a business is even possible. In my musical career, I have to admit a shortcoming in my engagement with music has been songwriting and composing lyrics or music on my own. And that's not only an artistic shortcoming, but I guess one way that I've rationalized that is that based on some things that happened to me when I was growing up and my feeling about how music relates to that cultural problem in the Western world, I have no interest in gaining any kind of acclaim whatsoever as an individual artist in my own right. I have so much more interest, like working as a choir director as I am, creating a community that gets together, has like a potluck dinner, and then makes music together, where no one's individual identity is being celebrated over this creation of music together. That's my dream for music now, is using it as a way to foster more community engagement and cultural life.
That really also brings to light a lot of the perverse incentives amongst those who are in a position to participate in the creative economy as it exists now. You could go to Juilliard, you could come out, let's say you're the best prodigy, who cares, right? You have the talent to work in the entertainment industry as we know it. You could do a whole lot of things, right? Are you gonna find actual community, Or are you going to be coached from the very beginning by your lecturers, by your peers, that like, no, you got to get going on TikTok. You got to do this. You got to do that, right? And get that thing going on. Because it's still just your evidence of it, just real organic people getting together and playing music. But when people want that to be a full-time income, it's going to become a business. It's going to be driven by things like, okay, do we get a sponsor? Do we get a grant? Do we get ad revenue from a company like Meta or Google? Even in the earlier parts of my musical journey, the infrastructure we have now and the incentives that exist now didn't really even exist all that much. I mean, I remember MySpace and all that, and certainly that got some people famous, but man, like, it's changed as I've gone along. And to your point about the sort of individual creator, I think you touch on something very important there too. Many of the role models we've been exposed to through popular culture, through popular music, are these iconic individuals. You could be talking about a David Bowie, you could be talking about Prince, you could be talking about Elvis, Michael Jackson. It's about this idea of this creative genius, this singular phenomenon. When people talk about a lot of these icons, they often talk about the phenomenon more than they do their output. You know, when you talk about Michael Jackson, obviously people like Thriller, the album, of course, but people are kind of more talking about like, wow, this guy sold this many records, he went on these shows. So there is this idol worship history of pop culture that has, I would say, pretty much right up until roughly now, has generally informed people's exposure to media. I think it has shifted in a way that's maybe somewhat good, where it's turned into like a wider call.
Just social media, yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's crazy, because you could talk about the ills of social media, but you could also talk about how it might provide some framework for a more democratic culture, or one that is about communal interest and intrigue, as opposed to, oh, look at me, I'm the best one. I won the American Idol contest.
Yeah, our social lives were changed permanently by social media. I listen to a lot of good podcasts about that world, both in terms of technical production, like from programmers who work at Meta, who work at Twitter, God help us all, down to people whose career as podcasters or as musicians really took off on social media rather than through conventional means. It's like talking about gentrification. We recognize the problem and we can prescribe its origins all we want, but at the end of the day, I'm still the guy going to the microbrew to buy a beer and go on a Tinder date. You know, I'm very much a participant in it because it's the only game in town with any vague appeal.
Yeah, no, I think there has to be a sense of realism where we recognize that to participate. And again, this situation has escalated very quickly. I think 10 years ago, you could have probably made an argument that you could largely go off, you know, mobile, let's say. At this stage in our society, without being pretty deeply embedded into the big five tech groups, functioning in this society or having a social life or being able to find employment.
Yeah. And the kind of talk that circulates among the farm folks, like the hippie back to the landers, who can be left-wing or they can be right-wing, as the whole COVID anti-vax thing taught us. Yeah. Man, I got plenty more stories there. Like, they're talking about, oh, we need to tear the whole system down and make sure that everyone unplugs. Like, at this stage in post-industrial economic development, that would kill a lot of working class people.
Right. It would be a catastrophic type of human event.
Yeah, both in a literal and a metaphorical sense. Working at an Amazon warehouse and trying to unionize employees inside the belly of this giant tech beast, I think that's the way forward. Like, we do have to try and navigate within the systems created by these tech overlords, right, and reclaim power inside them in order to move forward. I think this whole burn it all down attitude, as exemplified by the hippie counterculture that is now increasingly aligned with the Trump movement and with like the RFK Juniors. Yeah.
No, I think that is a fascinating development, because without a doubt, the broader countercultural movements of the mid-20th century were very impactful and led to real progress. And a lot of these social norms are frankly declining as we speak, but kind of the social norms of the late 20th century, right, into the early 21st, were essentially developed in that time period.
I mean, the cultural contributions of like the hippie boomer generation. I'm a little more pessimistic and skeptical. I mean, they made some great music. Since I'm more of a folkie, that's the soup stock that a lot of my own personal cultural preferences are made from. The hippie scene, there were things about it that were incredibly individualistic. A lot of the arguments that I have with my anarchist punk friends that I tried to get involved with the labor organizing beat that I'm on now, some of them reacted kind of adversely to it. Like a lot of the basic tenets and conclusions of that hippie movement ended up being surprisingly libertarian.
The problem is that the general incentive structure in the US is this individualism in the mainstream. And even as the counterculture develops, it more or less often reinforces the very same ideals of the American individualist. And again, in the US history, the very few times in which collective action really was what it was all about was that early 20th century significant labor movement that led to things like the New Deal that has shaped pretty much a lot of the core economic promises that Americans enjoy today. Essentially, the American socialism that Americans enjoy today. Well, for now. We got a lot to cover there, but I think we've covered a lot of interesting bases, and I think this conversation has not been defined by one or two key points, but was rather just a good exercise in like synergistically exchanging information.
Well, that's what you get bringing on a guest who was diagnosed with ADHD at one point. So,
Yes.
you get out what you put in, huh?
Well, I really thank you for coming on. I thank you for your time and your insights. And obviously, we will speak again.
Hell yeah, man. It'd be a pleasure to come on anytime.
Thanks for listening to Malmborg Report. If you enjoyed this episode, follow me on social media at It's John Malmborg and subscribe to Malmborg Report on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Want to stay in the loop? Sign up for my email list at johnmalmborg.com. And if you'd like to support the show directly, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Malmborg Report. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.